meet my bride. Let's go for a ride in my newfangled automobile. Just where we will go, nobody knows, but it's sure a great way to feel. Behind the wheel of the speed meter steel, it's my newfangled automobile.
Hello and welcome to Vintage Car History. I'm Wild Bill. Now, my mother used to say, old artists never die, they just lose their perspective. She would know, being a career professional artist herself. Yet it can also happen to a young artist. If someone becomes blind in one eye, they lose binocular vision and thus depth perception, which of course affects perspective. Yet even with such a handicap, there was a man, born an artist but instead became an engineer, who would prove to be one of automotive history's greatest sculptors of cars, Louis Delage. Connoisseurs of fine spirits know that amongst the best of double-distilled brandies is called cognac, and the small French town of Cognac gave this liquor its name. And in 1874, Pierre-Louis Adolphe Delage was born into this vineyard-covered town. His father was the local watchman, which means that he managed the railroad station and intermodal. Cognac exported quite a bit of both brandy and salt, having salt mines interspaced between the vineyards. Thus, the infant Louis was born into a locomotive family. It was in his infancy that, due to an illness, he lost sight in one eye. It did not stop him from romping around the rail yard as a young lad, which led him to wanting to someday become a locomotive engineer. His father managed to get the money together to send him to one of the best engineering schools in all of France, the École des Hautes Métiers, where he would graduate from in 1893 with his engineering degree. After 2 years of required service in the French army, he returned to the railroad, becoming an engineer as was the dream of his youth. For the next 5 years, he operated various steam trains across southern France. Yet it was at this time that automobiles began to appear on the roads, many of them attempting to do impromptu races against his locomotive. It was from this that the car bug bit him, and in 1900, Delage left the railroad to get into the car business. His first stop was Peugeot. He found work there as a design engineer and spent the next few years learning the automotive business. He was offered a chief engineer position with the then young company Renault in 1903 and would spend the next 2 years infusing his ideas and sense of style into Renault cars, accumulating in the ubiquitous Type AG taxi. Yet he had other ideas for car design, not the least of which was to put the radiator in front of the engine instead of behind it, and in 1905 scraped up enough money to open his own concern, the Delage Automobile Company. The first Delage cars rolled out of their barn factory the next year and were an instant success. Louis had an eye for design, literally, and felt that how a car feels in the hand is just as important to how it looks. A car should look like it's moving, even when it's standing still, and its sweeping shapes should make a person want to feel it, running their hand down the lines of the car to make speed a tactile thing. These first Delage cars were small Voiturettes using single-cylinder De Dion engines, yet were well built and with his own flair for style. And these were small, nimble, and fast cars. Delage immediately took his cars to the races and found success. Though the car's first outing ended in a crash, the second one ended with his car and driver finishing second in the Coupe de Voiturette racing circuit of the time. Delage took the win at the 1908 Coupe de Voiturette race in Dieppe and powered by a new engine designed by Nemorin Caussin. But Louis officially claimed that it had a De Dion engine to keep his main engine supplier happy. Mr. Caussin left the company over this issue. The new engine designer for Delage, Mr. Arthur Michelat, began to design some incredible drive chains, and by 1910, Delage was now casting their own engines and making their own transmissions. Delage were amongst the first cars on or off the track to have 5-speed transmissions, 4 valves per cylinder, overhead cams, and other such innovations. These cars were well built and fast. Indeed, a Delage won the 1913 Grand Prix at Le Mans and the 1914 Indianapolis 500. and they had style. Louis crafted each car to be beautiful to behold, to touch, and to drive. Consider the 1914 Type A1, which was in production just before World War I. Under the hood was a 2.3-liter four-cylinder side valve engine giving some 30 horsepower, coupled to a 4-speed transmission. The torpedo body just made one's eyes perform sweeping gazes and glances. Comfortable inside and pleasing to the senses, the Delage was the pinnacle of pre-war French sports cars. Of course, after the war, Delage designs became cars of legend and are amongst the most valuable cars in the world today. And we'll look at some of those in the future. Louis Delage made cars that to this day look like they're moving when they're just parked. Perhaps it was his loss of perspective that drove his uncanny ability to change our own view of what makes a beautiful car. Thanks for watching Vintage Car History, and we'll see you next week. Peace.